In 1921, something extraordinary existed in the heart of the United States. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, a black community had built wealth, stability, and independence at a time when such success was rarely tolerated. Greenwood was home to doctors, lawyers, newspapers, banks, and businesses that thrived without outside support. It became known as Black Wall Street. And then, almost overnight, it disappeared. Not through accident. Not through economic failure. But through destruction followed by silence. What happened in Tulsa was not merely an outbreak of chaos. It was a moment when violence was allowed, records were altered, and accountability was avoided. Buildings were reduced to ash, lives were uprooted, and a community was erased from the physical landscape. Yet what followed may have been even more deliberate than the destruction itself. For decades, official histories said little. School textbooks omitted the event. Local authorities denied responsibility. Insurance claims were rejected. Survivors were left without justice, and often without acknowledgement. This was not just a tragedy that occurred and faded with time. It was a story that was buried. A truth that was managed, minimized, and postponed for generations. The absence of this history was not accidental. It was the result of decisions made after the smoke cleared. To understand Black Wall Street, we must look beyond what was destroyed, and examine why its story was hidden for so long. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States was a nation defined by rapid growth and deep division. Industrial wealth expanded cities, railroads connected regions, and new opportunities emerged for many Americans. Yet this progress was uneven. For black citizens, especially in the South, the promise of freedom after the Civil War had been replaced by segregation, disenfranchisement, and economic exclusion. Jim Crow laws governed daily life, limiting where people could live, work, vote, and even gather. Against this backdrop, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, emerged as a rare and remarkable exception. Founded by black entrepreneurs and supported by black residents, Greenwood became a self-sustaining community. Businesses were owned locally, money circulated within the neighborhood, and professional services, from medical care to legal counsel, were available without dependence on white institutions. Churches, schools, newspapers, and theaters formed the social and cultural backbone of the district. This concentration of success earned Greenwood its most famous nickname, Black Wall Street. Tulsa itself was a city shaped by oil wealth and ambition. In the early 1900s, Oklahoma experienced rapid economic expansion, drawing migrants, investors, and laborers from across the country. While white Tulsa benefited enormously from oil discoveries, black residents were largely excluded from that wealth. Greenwood's prosperity, therefore, did not come from shared opportunity but from determination within a segregated system. It stood as a visible contradiction to prevailing narratives that portrayed black communities as dependent or incapable of economic independence. Racial tension was not an abstract force in this period, it was embedded in law and reinforced through violence. Across the United States, lynchings were used as tools of intimidation, and accusations against black individuals were often treated as proof rather than claims. Newspapers frequently inflamed fear, portraying black advancement as a threat to social order. Local governments rarely intervened to protect black citizens, and in many cases, law enforcement actively participated in racial violence. In Oklahoma, these national patterns were intensified by the state's short but turbulent history. Having entered the Union in 1907, Oklahoma quickly adopted segregationist policies. Voting restrictions, housing barriers, and unequal policing became normalized. Tulsa was no exception. While Greenwood thrived economically, it existed under constant pressure, separated physically and politically from white neighborhoods. Its success was visible, but its security was fragile. Understanding this context is essential. Black Wall Street did not exist in isolation, nor was it an anomaly without consequence. It was a product of resilience within a hostile system, and that very resilience made it a target. What followed in 1921 cannot be separated from the social climate, the political indifference, and the racial hierarchies of the time. The events in Tulsa were not spontaneous. They unfolded within a nation that had already decided whose lives and histories were worth protecting. The events that unfolded in Tulsa in late May of 1921 did not emerge from nowhere. They began with a single incident that, under ordinary circumstances, might have been handled quietly and lawfully. Instead, it became the spark that ignited long-simmering tension. A young black man named Dick Rowland was accused of an encounter with a white elevator operator in downtown Tulsa. The details were unclear from the beginning, and no serious evidence of wrongdoing was ever established. Yet the accusation alone was enough to trigger a chain reaction. Local newspapers quickly reported the story in sensational terms. Headlines amplified fear and suspicion, framing the situation as a threat rather than an allegation. In an era when rumors traveled faster than facts, the narrative took hold before any investigation could unfold. Rowland was arrested and taken to the county courthouse, where word spread that a lynching might occur. For black residents of Greenwood, this possibility was not abstract. It was a familiar and deadly pattern repeated across the country. In response, a group of armed black men traveled to the courthouse, intending to protect Rowland from mob violence. Their presence was defensive, not aggressive. However, it was interpreted by white onlookers as provocation. Tensions escalated rapidly. Crowds gathered, weapons were distributed, and law enforcement struggled, or failed, to de-escalate the situation. A confrontation followed, shots were fired, and chaos began to spread beyond the courthouse steps. What followed was not a single clash, but a coordinated assault on Greenwood itself. White mobs moved into the district, targeting homes, businesses, and institutions. Streets that had once been busy with commerce and community life were overtaken by destruction. Fire spread block by block, consuming buildings that represented decades of labor and progress. Residents fled where they could, seeking safety amid confusion and fear. Crucially, the response of local authorities shaped the outcome. Rather than protecting Greenwood, elements of law enforcement aligned with or enabled the attackers. Some officers deputized members of the mob, granting them authority rather than restraining them. Others focused on detaining black residents, removing them from their neighborhoods while the destruction continued. This imbalance of protection and enforcement allowed the violence to expand unchecked. By the time the smoke cleared, Greenwood lay in ruins. Thousands of people were displaced, and an entire economic ecosystem had been dismantled. Yet the immediate aftermath did not bring accountability. Instead, attention shifted toward restoring order and moving forward, often without addressing responsibility. The physical damage was visible, but the mechanisms that allowed it to happen remained largely unexamined. The beginning of the Black Wall Street tragedy was not defined solely by violence. It was defined by decisions, how accusations were reported, how fear was cultivated, and how authority was exercised. These early moments set the stage for what would come next, not only destruction, but a long and deliberate effort to control how the story would be told, if it was told at all. When the violence in Tulsa finally subsided, the question was no longer what had happened, but how it would be addressed. In moments of national crisis, accountability often begins with investigation, transparency, and acknowledgement. In Tulsa, the opposite occurred. The systems designed to uphold law, order, and justice failed, not only during the destruction of Greenwood, but in the deliberate silence that followed. Almost immediately, responsibility was deflected. Local officials framed the events as a breakdown of order rather than a targeted attack. Language mattered. By avoiding clear descriptions, authorities shaped public perception, turning a coordinated assault into a vague disturbance. This framing allowed institutions to distance themselves from scrutiny. If no one named the crime, no one had to answer for it. Law enforcement agencies played a central role in this failure. Reports from the period reveal that officers arrested large numbers of black residents after the violence, detaining them in temporary holding areas. These detentions were not about protection or due process. They were about control. Meanwhile, few arrests were made among those who had participated in the destruction of Greenwood. This imbalance reinforced a message that justice would not be applied equally. The judicial system followed a similar pattern. Despite the scale of the devastation, prosecutions were virtually non-existent. Grand jury proceedings were convened, but their conclusions avoided assigning blame. Instead, they emphasized the alleged actions of black residents as contributing factors, redirecting attention away from institutional responsibility. By framing the community as partially at fault, the system absolved itself. Economic systems compounded the damage. Insurance companies refused to honor claims filed by Greenwood residents, citing riot clauses in their policies. This technical justification ignored the reality that the destruction had been widespread and organized. Without financial support, rebuilding became nearly impossible. Families who had lost everything were forced to start over with no compensation, while the economic foundations of Greenwood remained fractured. The role of government extended beyond immediate responses. City planners used the aftermath as an opportunity to reshape Tulsa's landscape. Proposals emerged to rezone Greenwood for industrial use, effectively preventing residents from rebuilding their community. While some of these plans were resisted, the intent revealed how power could be exercised quietly, through paperwork rather than force. Bureaucratic decisions became tools of erasure. Perhaps the most enduring failure was educational. For decades, the events of 1921 were absent from school curricula. Generations of students grew up without learning about Black Wall Street or its destruction. This absence was not accidental. Curriculum choices reflect values, and the decision to omit this history signaled a reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths. Silence became normalized. Media institutions also contributed to this erasure. Early coverage often relied on official statements, repeating sanitized narratives without investigation. As time passed, the lack of sustained reporting allowed the story to fade from public consciousness. Without journalists pressing for answers, the events were gradually reduced to footnotes or ignored entirely. Systemic failure is rarely the result of a single decision. It emerges from alignment when political interests, legal structures, economic incentives, and social norms move in the same direction. In Tulsa, these systems aligned toward avoidance. Acknowledging the truth would have required confronting racism, institutional complicity, and the misuse of authority. Silence was easier. This prolonged silence had consequences beyond Tulsa. It reinforced a broader national pattern in which racial violence could occur without lasting accountability. It sent a signal that economic success did not guarantee protection and that historical memory could be shaped by those in power. The failure to address Black Wall Street honestly became part of a larger story about whose suffering is documented and whose is ignored. Understanding this silence is essential. The destruction of Greenwood was devastating, but the systemic failure that followed ensured its impact would last far longer. By refusing to confront what happened, institutions transformed a moment of violence into a legacy of denial. And denial, sustained over decades, can be as damaging as the original act itself. The destruction of Black Wall Street did not end with the final fires in Greenwood. Its true impact unfolded slowly, across decades, shaping lives, families, and the economic trajectory of an entire community. What was lost in 1921 was not only property, but momentum, an intergenerational path toward stability that had been carefully built and then abruptly severed. For survivors, rebuilding was not a matter of choice but necessity. Many returned to the ruins of Greenwood with little more than determination. Churches reopened in temporary structures, businesses operated out of makeshift spaces, and families rebuilt homes using salvaged materials. These efforts reflected resilience, but they occurred without institutional support. The absence of compensation and protection meant that recovery was uneven and fragile. Economically, the long shadow was profound. Generational wealth depends on continuity, assets passed down, businesses expanded, opportunities multiplied over time. Greenwood's destruction interrupted this process. Property that might have appreciated was lost. Businesses that could have grown were eliminated. For many families, the gap created in 1921 was never closed. The economic consequences extended far beyond Tulsa, reinforcing national patterns of racial wealth inequality. Psychologically, the impact was equally enduring. Survivors carried memories of fear, loss, and betrayal, often in silence. Many chose not to speak openly about what they experienced, not because the memories faded, but because the environment discouraged acknowledgement. Trauma became private, passed down indirectly through stories left unfinished and questions unanswered. The lack of public recognition compounded this pain, signaling that their suffering was not worthy of remembrance. The broader community also felt the effects. Greenwood never fully regained its pre-1921 status as a concentrated center of Black economic power. While progress occurred, it unfolded within constraints shaped by zoning decisions, infrastructure projects, and limited access to capital. Highways and urban development projects later cut through the district, further disrupting continuity and reinforcing patterns of displacement that echoed earlier losses. Nationally, the story of Black Wall Street remained largely absent from conversations about American history. This omission influenced how racial violence was understood or misunderstood. Without acknowledgement, patterns repeated elsewhere, and lessons went unlearned. The silence surrounding Tulsa contributed to a broader narrative in which progress was celebrated without confronting the costs borne by marginalized communities. The long shadow of the cover-up also affected trust. When institutions fail to acknowledge past harm, skepticism takes root. For many, the absence of accountability reinforced doubts about whether justice systems serve all citizens equally. This erosion of trust did not emerge suddenly, it accumulated over generations, shaped by repeated experiences of exclusion and denial. Yet within the shadow, there were efforts to preserve memory. Families maintained oral histories. Community leaders advocated for recognition. Scholars and journalists began to revisit the events, piecing together records that had been ignored. These efforts did not erase the losses, but they laid the groundwork for a shift from silence toward acknowledgement. The long shadow of Black Wall Street is not defined solely by what was taken, but by what was delayed. Justice postponed. Recognition deferred. Opportunities interrupted. Understanding this extended impact is essential, because it reveals how a single moment, when left unaddressed, can influence generations. The legacy of Greenwood is not confined to 1921, it continues to shape conversations about memory, accountability, and the cost of silence in American history. For much of the 20th century, the destruction of Black Wall Street remained largely absent from public discussion. This silence did not last forever. Beginning in the late 1990s, a gradual shift occurred as journalists, historians, and community advocates began to challenge the long-standing absence of accountability. What had once been dismissed or ignored slowly re-entered public consciousness. One of the earliest catalysts for renewed attention was the work of local researchers and survivors who refused to let the story disappear. Oral histories were recorded, personal documents were preserved, and fragments of memory were assembled into a fuller narrative. These efforts revealed the extent to which official accounts had minimized the scale and responsibility of what occurred in 1921. As evidence accumulated, the gap between lived experience and public record became increasingly difficult to ignore. Media coverage played a critical role in this re-examination. Investigative reporting brought national attention to Tulsa's past, framing the events not as isolated unrest but as a coordinated act of destruction followed by decades of denial. Newspapers, documentaries, and academic studies challenged earlier narratives and introduced the story to audiences who had never encountered it in school or public discourse. This exposure transformed local memory into a national conversation. Public reaction evolved alongside this renewed visibility. For many Americans, learning about Black Wall Street prompted shock and disbelief. Questions emerged about how such a significant event could be omitted from mainstream history for so long. For others, particularly within Black communities, the renewed attention validated experiences that had long been dismissed or minimized. Recognition, even delayed, carried emotional weight. Government response followed public pressure. In Oklahoma, a state commission was formed to investigate the events of 1921. The commission's findings confirmed the scale of destruction and acknowledged the failures of local authorities. While the report marked a significant step toward official recognition, it also highlighted the limitations of retrospective accountability. The passage of time complicated efforts to assign responsibility or provide direct restitution. Debate intensified around the issue of reparations. Survivors and descendants argued that acknowledgement without compensation was incomplete. Legal challenges were raised, seeking redress for property loss and personal harm. These efforts faced significant obstacles, including statutes of limitation and legal interpretations that favored institutional closure over historical justice. Public opinion was divided, reflecting broader national debates about responsibility, memory, and repair. Educational institutions responded unevenly. Some schools incorporated the history of Black Wall Street into curricula, while others resisted changes. Museums and cultural centers began to include exhibits addressing the events of 1921, offering spaces for reflection and dialogue. These initiatives signaled progress, but they also underscored how much had been left undone. The public reaction to renewed exposure was not uniform. While many welcomed the acknowledgement, others questioned its relevance or expressed discomfort with revisiting the past. This tension revealed an ongoing struggle over historical memory, whether confronting difficult truths strengthens a society or challenges established narratives too deeply. Ultimately, the exposure of the Black Wall Street cover-up did more than correct a historical omission. It forced a broader reckoning with how history is recorded, who controls its narrative, and whose experiences are deemed worthy of recognition. The public reaction, shaped by media, scholarship, and advocacy, demonstrated that silence can endure for decades, but it is rarely permanent. The renewed attention given to Black Wall Street did not remain confined to historical discussion. Over time, it began to influence policy debates, public memorialization, and broader conversations about racial justice in the United States. While the damage of 1921 could not be undone, the acknowledgement of what occurred opened space for change, incremental, contested, and often incomplete. One of the most visible shifts was official recognition. State and local governments began to publicly acknowledge the destruction of Greenwood as a historical injustice rather than an unfortunate disturbance. Memorials were established, anniversaries were formally observed, and public statements were issued recognizing the suffering endured by residents. These acts carried symbolic importance, marking a departure from decades of silence. Educational reforms followed, though unevenly. In Oklahoma, the history of Black Wall Street was incorporated into state education standards, ensuring that future generations would learn about the events of 1921. This inclusion represented a significant institutional change. Where history had once been omitted, it was now acknowledged as essential to understanding both local and national narratives. However, implementation varied, and broader national adoption remained inconsistent. Legal and political efforts to address the aftermath continued to face resistance. Lawsuits seeking reparations were met with procedural barriers, including statutes of limitation and jurisdictional challenges. Courts often ruled that too much time had passed for legal remedies to be applied. These decisions highlighted the limits of traditional legal frameworks when addressing historical harm, especially when that harm had been deliberately obscured. Despite these obstacles, advocacy persisted. Community leaders, historians, and descendants of survivors continued to press for recognition, investment, and policy responses. Their efforts reframed reparations not solely as financial compensation, but as a broader commitment to repair, through economic development, preservation of historic sites, and targeted investment in affected communities. This reframing shifted public discussion from punishment toward responsibility. Changes were also visible in public memory. Museums, documentaries, and academic research expanded the narrative of Black Wall Street, situating it within a larger history of racial violence and systemic inequality. This growing body of work challenged simplified versions of American progress and emphasized the importance of confronting uncomfortable truths. As awareness increased, so did the expectation that institutions would respond with transparency rather than avoidance. The aftermath of the cover-up also influenced how similar events were examined elsewhere. The recognition that history could be suppressed for decades prompted renewed scrutiny of other overlooked episodes. In this way, Greenwood became both a case study and a cautionary example, illustrating how silence can shape national memory, and how acknowledgement, even delayed, can alter discourse. Yet it is important to note that change did not arrive as a single resolution. It unfolded through gradual shifts in language, policy, and public awareness. Some efforts stalled. Others advanced slowly. Progress was uneven and often met with skepticism. This complexity reflects the reality of addressing historical injustice. Acknowledgement is necessary, but it is rarely sufficient on its own. The aftermath of Black Wall Street continues to evolve. Its story now occupies a more visible place in American history, but the work of addressing its legacy remains ongoing. The changes that followed recognition, educational, cultural, and political, demonstrate how confronting the past can influence the present. They also reveal how much remains unresolved when silence lasts longer than justice. The story of Black Wall Street does not belong solely to the past. Its relevance persists because the forces that shaped its destruction and subsequent silence continue to influence modern society. At its core, this history raises enduring questions about power, memory, and responsibility, questions that remain unresolved in contemporary America. One of the most striking lessons of Greenwood is how narratives are controlled. The absence of Black Wall Street from mainstream history for decades was not the result of missing information, but of selective attention. This pattern echoes in modern debates over whose stories are included in public discourse and whose are marginalized. The mechanisms may differ: curriculum decisions, media framing, political rhetoric, but the outcome can be similar. Certain experiences remain invisible unless actively recovered. The issue of institutional accountability remains central. In Tulsa, multiple systems failed simultaneously: law enforcement, courts, media, and local government. Today, public trust in institutions is shaped by how transparently they address past and present failures. When acknowledgement is delayed or resisted, skepticism grows. Greenwood serves as a reminder that legitimacy is not sustained by authority alone, but by honesty and accountability over time. Economic inequality also connects past to present. The destruction of generational wealth in 1921 contributes to broader patterns still visible today. While Greenwood's specific circumstances were unique, the interruption of economic continuity reflects a recurring challenge faced by marginalized communities. Discussions about wealth gaps, access to capital, and economic mobility cannot be fully understood without recognizing how historical events constrained opportunity long before modern policy debates began. Memory plays a crucial role in shaping civic identity. Societies define themselves not only by achievements, but by how they confront wrongdoing. The renewed attention to Black Wall Street illustrates a growing willingness to engage with difficult chapters of history. This engagement is not about assigning collective guilt, but about understanding how past decisions inform present conditions. Reflection, when approached thoughtfully, can strengthen democratic values rather than weaken them. Modern relevance is also evident in conversations about historical justice. Debates over reparations, memorialization, and policy reform are not confined to Greenwood. They appear wherever communities seek recognition for harm that was minimized or denied. Black Wall Street has become a reference point in these discussions, illustrating both the challenges and possibilities of addressing long-standing injustice. Technology and access to information have altered how history is shared. Digital archives, online journalism, and educational platforms have made it harder for significant events to remain hidden indefinitely. Yet visibility alone does not guarantee understanding. The Greenwood story underscores the importance of context, interpretation, and sustained engagement. Without these, exposure risks becoming superficial rather than transformative. Ultimately, reflecting on Black Wall Street is an exercise in responsibility. It asks modern audiences to consider not only what happened, but how silence was maintained, and how easily it can be repeated. The relevance of Greenwood lies in its warning that progress without memory is fragile, and that democracy depends on a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. By examining this history with care and honesty, the story of Black Wall Street moves beyond a single event. It becomes part of a broader conversation about how societies remember, how institutions evolve, and how the past continues to shape the present. That conversation is ongoing, and its outcome will help define the future. The story of Black Wall Street is not defined only by what was destroyed, but by what was deliberately forgotten. Greenwood's buildings can be rebuilt, its streets renamed, and its history taught, but the deeper lesson lies in how easily truth can be suppressed when silence serves power. What happened in Tulsa forces us to confront a difficult reality. History is not just written by those who act, but by those who choose what is remembered. For decades, the absence of this story shaped public understanding. Generations grew up unaware that such a prosperous community existed, let alone that it was dismantled and denied justice. This absence was not neutral. It influenced how inequality was explained, how responsibility was avoided, and how progress was measured. When history omits loss, it also omits accountability. Black Wall Street reminds us that economic success alone does not guarantee security when systems are unequal. Greenwood followed the rules available to it, built institutions, created opportunity, and fostered community. Yet none of this shielded it from destruction or denial. The lesson is sobering: resilience can be erased if institutions fail to protect it, and silence can extend harm long after violence ends. The lasting message of this story is not about assigning blame to the past, but about recognizing responsibility in the present. A society committed to justice cannot rely on partial memory. It must be willing to examine uncomfortable chapters honestly, even when they challenge national narratives or institutional reputations. Acknowledgement is not an endpoint, it is a foundation. Remembering Black Wall Street is an act of restoration. It restores dignity to those whose experiences were dismissed. It restores complexity to history that was oversimplified. And it restores trust when institutions demonstrate a willingness to confront what they once ignored. This process is neither quick nor easy, but it is necessary. As this story reaches modern audiences, it carries a quiet question forward: what histories remain unspoken today, and why? The answer to that question will shape how future generations understand justice, progress, and truth. Black Wall Street endures not only as a memory of loss, but as a reminder that silence is a choice, and that choosing to remember can change how a society moves forward.
Thank you for watching.